a.m., Lake Superior. French Commander Marcel Leclerc, squinting through a frosted porthole, watches the dim masthead lights of the Inkerman and Cerisoles dancing in the chaos behind him. 1 second, they are battling 30-foot freshwater giants. The next, the abyss simply swallows them. No screams, no SOS, just the roar of a 60-mile-per-hour gale and a sudden, terrifying void on the horizon. 78 war heroes, men who survived the bloody trenches of Europe, vanished into a crack in the world's largest lake. Over a century later, the ice-cold depths refused to surrender a single splinter of wood or a trace of the bone. Was it a fatal design flaw, a calculated sacrifice, or a hunger in the lake that science cannot explain? Stay with me until the very end, because as we peel back a century of silence, you'll discover that some secrets aren't just lost. They are waiting to be found. By 1918, the world was bleeding. For 4 years, Europe had been a slaughterhouse, and the seas were no different. But as the conflict neared its end, a new, invisible terror haunted the waves: the naval mine. These were not just weapons of war. They were instruments of strangulation. Thousands of German underwater explosives lay hidden beneath the tides of the English Channel and along the French coastline, waiting to tear the bottom out of any merchant ship brave enough to carry food or medicine to a starving continent. The naval mine was a patient predator, and it posed a deadly threat to the survival of the French people even after the fighting stopped. France was desperate. They knew that when the guns finally fell silent, their nation would still remain paralyzed if the shipping lanes were not cleared. But there was a catastrophic problem. For 4 long years, every French shipyard had been pushed to the breaking point, focused entirely on churning out frontline combat vessels. They had no room, no time, and no steel left to build the specialized minesweepers required to secure the peace. The solution had to come from across the Atlantic. Initially, the French government turned their eyes to the United States, specifically to the Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company in Wisconsin. They requested a dozen specialized minesweepers to clear their shores. But Manitowoc's order books were already overflowing with American commissions. They simply could not take on the work. This refusal set the stage for one of the most unlikely partnerships in maritime history. The contract, valued at $2.6 million, an amount equivalent to over $53 million today, was awarded to the Canadian Car and Foundry Company, famously known as CanCar. Based in Montreal but operating a massive facility in Fort William, Ontario, CanCar was a master of the rails. They built railway equipment, locomotives, and rolling stock. They were experts in steel, yes, but their steel was meant for the solid earth of the Canadian prairies, not the violent swells of the North Atlantic. Yet, in the final months of the Great War, this railway giant was asked to pivot. In a display of industrial mobilization that remains breathtaking even today, CanCar shifted its entire production from rail cars to the Navarin-class minesweepers. But this transformation faced a geographical paradox that would have defeated a lesser company. The Fort William facility was not a shipyard. It was an industrial plant situated 500 yards away from the nearest water. Imagine the logistical nightmare. How do you launch a 630-ton vessel of war when your assembly line ends in a field of dirt? The solution was as inconvenient as it was brilliant. They built a specialized marine railway, a system of tracks and cradles stretching from the assembly building all the way down to the Kaministikia River. Every ship born in that factory had to be wheeled across the land before it could ever taste the water. It was a miracle of engineering, but it was also a sign of the immense hurdles that defined the birth of these vessels. The greatest risk, however, was not the geography. It was the hands that built the ships. In 1918, Canada was still largely an agricultural nation. When the call for warships came, the skilled labor market was already bone dry. Draftsmen, shop foremen, and expert metal workers were in desperately short supply, drafted into the war or already working in coastal yards. Concar didn't have months to wait. They needed a workforce immediately. What they assembled was what we call a polyglot crew, a diverse, patchwork army of labor. They took farmers who had spent their lives behind a plow and taught them to hold a rivet gun. They supplemented this raw Canadian talent with a massive influx of American workers from across the border. It was a chaotic, multilingual environment where the urgency of war was the only common language. While these men were highly competent in their own right, they were building something they had never built before. They were learning the handle of a warship on the fly under the most unforgiving pressure imaginable. The pressure came from the calendar. The contract was signed with an ambitious 6-month deadline to complete all 12 vessels. Work on the first ship, the Navarin, began in June 1918. From that moment, the clock was ticking against the most formidable enemy in the Great Lakes: winter. The French didn't just need these ships, they needed them before the ice closed the season. By the time the Inkerman and the Cerisoles, the last two of the series, were ready, the situation was dire. It was already November. In the Great Lakes, November is not a month, it is a warning. The crews rushed through the final fit-outs, mounting the 2 4-inch deck guns and conducting hurried shakedown cruises. There was a desperate rush to get the flotilla to Montreal before the various locks, the Sault at Sault Ste. Marie and the Welland Canal, shook their gates shut for the season. If the ships didn't make it past the Sault locks in time, they would be trapped in the ice for 6 months, idle and useless, while French shipping lanes remained infested with German mines. This haste, this relentless drive to meet the deadline of a war that had technically just ended, created an atmosphere of extreme urgency. The Inkerman and the Cerisoles were the products of a miraculous industrial effort, built by a patchwork crew in a factory that wasn't a shipyard, and launched into a race against the freezing grip of Lake Superior. They were born of steel and fire, but they were also born of a rush that left no room for error on a lake that never forgives a mistake. To understand the tragedy of the Inkerman and the Cerisoles, we must look past the bravery of the men and stare directly into the steel and timber of the machines they commanded. These were not just ships. They were the Navarin-class minesweepers, a breed of vessel born from the desperate ingenuity of a world at war. They were designed for a very specific, very dangerous purpose: to hunt and destroy the silent killers of the deep. But in their very design lay a series of technical contradictions, a set of Achilles' heels that would eventually leave them defenseless against the raw power of Lake Superior. Let us begin with the bones of these vessels. The Navarin class featured a hybrid construction that was both a marvel of wartime efficiency and a source of hidden vulnerability. These were steel-framed, wooden-hulled ships. The choice of wood over steel for the outer skin was not accidental. In the world of minesweeping, wood offered a degree of flexibility and, crucially, reduced the magnetic signature of the vessel, making it less likely to trigger certain types of naval mines. But this choice meant that, while the skeleton was rigid and strong, the skin was organic and susceptible to the relentless pounding of heavy seas. It was a delicate balance of strength and suppleness, a design intended for the coastal waters of France and the English Channel, not for the crushing, rhythmic hammers of a freshwater gale. The dimensions of these ships tell a story of compact power. Each vessel measured 143 feet in length with a beam of 22.5 feet. They were relatively small, displacing 630 gross tons when fully loaded. To enhance their survivability in combat or storm, the engineers incorporated 4 independent watertight compartments. On paper, this was a formidable safety feature. If one section of the hull was breached by a mine or collision, the other 3 could theoretically keep the ship afloat. It gave the sailors a sense of security, a belief that these tough little ships were nearly unsinkable. But, as any Great Lakes mariner will tell you, watertight compartments only work if the ship remains upright. If the sea finds a way to turn the vessel over, no amount of internal bulkheads can save the men trapped inside. This brings us to the most dangerous element of their technical portrait: the weapons and the center of gravity. Despite their primary role being the clearing of mines, the French Navy insisted that these ships be ready for a fight. Each minesweeper was fitted with 2 massive 100mm deck guns, 4-inch cannons, one mounted forward at the bow and the other aft at the stern. These guns were capable of engaging targets up to 10 kilometers away. However, placing heavy artillery on a vessel with such a narrow beam created a catastrophic problem for stability. These guns were heavy, and they were mounted high on the deck. This significantly raised the ship's center of gravity. In calm water, it was a manageable risk. But in a violent storm, where 30-foot waves toss a ship like a child's toy, that high center of gravity becomes a death sentence. It created a constant, terrifying tendency for the ship to broach. Broaching occurs when a vessel loses helm control and is forced to turn sideways into the trough of the waves. When a ship as top-heavy as the Inkerman or the Cerisoles is hit broadside by a wall of water, that high center of gravity pulls the vessel over. Once the tipping point is reached, there is no coming back. The weight of the guns, the very things meant to protect the sailors, becomes the anchor that drags them into the abyss. It is a haunting irony of naval architecture. The pride of the French Navy, their deck guns likely became the primary instruments of their own destruction. Beyond their weaponry, we must examine their primary tool, the minesweeping gear. These ships were specialists. They were equipped with a simplistic yet mechanical system designed for one thing: the sweep. Imagine a long, saw-toothed wire cable dragged through the water at a specific angle off the sides of the ship. This cable was designed to snag the anchor wire of a naval mine. As the minesweeper steamed forward, the friction of the saw-toothed cable would cut through the mine's anchor line, releasing the explosive to float to the surface, where it could be destroyed by rifle fire. This was a brilliant system for the English Channel, but it made the ships incredibly specialized and, in many ways, inflexible. The planning devices, the cutters, and the heavy cables all added weight and complexity to the deck. These ships were built to move at 12.5 knots while performing a delicate, dangerous dance with underwater explosives. They were not general-purpose vessels. They were not built for the unpredictable, chaotic, and crushing environment of Lake Superior in November. Their specialized nature meant that every piece of equipment on that deck was a potential hazard in a gale. A piece of gear that could break loose, a cable that could snap, or a weight that could shift at exactly the wrong moment. Each of these ships was powered by 600 horsepower reciprocating engines driving twin screws. They were capable of 14.4 miles per hour, fast enough for coastal patrols, but perhaps not powerful enough to claw their way out of a 60-mile-per-hour gale when the water began to flood the boiler rooms. In the surviving accounts from the Sebastopol, we hear of the desperate struggle to keep the coal fires burning as water poured through leaking decks and hatches. The machinery, like the hull itself, was designed for a different world. The Inkerman and the Cerisoles were masterpieces of industrial mobilization, but they were technical anomalies on the Great Lakes. They were beasts with an Achilles heel, actually a series of them. A narrow beam made narrower by heavy guns, a hybrid hull that struggled against freshwater pressure, a specialized mission that left them ill-equipped for a general survival fight. They were tough, they were armed, and they were ready for the mines of Europe. But they were walking a tightrope across Lake Superior, and the safety net of their watertight compartments was about to be ripped away by a storm that didn't care about their historic names or their military victories. They were technical marvels, yes, but in the heart of a November gale, they were nothing more than fragile shells of steel and wood, waiting for the one mistake they couldn't recover from. At noon on November 23, 1918, 79 men stood on the decks of the Inkerman and the Cerisoles. These were not mere names on a manifest. They were a volatile mix of seasoned French naval heroes and veteran Canadian pilots, bound together by a desperate $2.6 million race against the winter ice. On the bridge of the Inkerman, we find Lieutenant Francois Mazou. He is the captain, a man whose skin has been toughened by 4 years of North Atlantic salt and the constant shadow of German U-boats. He is a decorated officer of the Marine Nationale, wearing the French War Cross with the quiet pride of a man who has looked death in the eye and survived the greatest slaughter in human history. To Mazou, Lake Superior looks like a pond. He is a master of the deep ocean, confident in his training and his vessel, yet dangerously unaware that the fresh water beneath his boots follows a different, more violent set of rules. Standing beside him is Captain R. Wilson, the Canadian pilot. Wilson is the eyes of the ship. He doesn't wear the gold braid of the French Navy, but he carries the internal map of every reef and current on Lake Superior. There is a silent, professional friction between these two men. Wilson knows that November on this lake is a predator. He understands that freshwater is thinner and faster to rise than the heavy brine Mazou is used to. He is the voice of caution, the only man on the bridge who truly fears the horizon. Across the water, on the sister ship Cerisoles, the scene is mirrored. Lieutenant Etienne Dud holds the command, supported by another veteran Canadian pilot, Captain W.J. Murphy. On that deck, 38 French sailors, including men like Clet Louarn and André Marigot, prepare for the same journey. Totaling 79 souls across both vessels, they are a collision of two worlds. The military discipline of the old world meeting the raw, unforgiving fury of the new world's inland sea. The atmosphere is not one of fear, but of intense, calculated pressure. The commander of the flotilla, Lieutenant Marcel Leclerc on the Sebastopol has made the mandate clear. The locks at the Sceaux and the Welland are closing. If they do not pass now, they will be trapped in the ice for 6 months. The calm of November 23, 1918, was a lethal deception. As the 3 minesweepers, the Sebastopol, the Inkerman, and the Cerisoles, steamed away from the sleeping giant and into the open expanse of Lake Superior, they were moving toward a collision between human ego and environmental fury. This chapter of the tragedy is not just about a storm. It is about the heavy price of arrogance and the moment when tactical decisions transformed a routine transit into a death trap. As the flotilla reached Passage Island at the northern tip of Isle Royale, the first cracks in the command structure began to show. The veteran Canadian pilots, men like Wilson and Murphy, who understood the shifting moods of Lake Superior, knew that a November sky was never to be trusted. They looked at the falling barometer and the gray, leaden horizon and urged Leclerc to take the traditional fall route, the northern passage closer to the Ontario shore. This route offered protection, a lee from the biting winds, and a chance to seek shelter if the weather turned. But Leclerc refused. To him, time was more precious than caution. He viewed the local pilots' concerns not as professional expertise, but as cowardice. In the official French investigation that followed, Leclerc's words remained etched in history as a chilling testament to his mindset. He dismissed the experienced Canadian mariners as a timid lot. He overruled their local knowledge, ignored their warnings, and ordered the flotilla to take a direct course across the deepest, most exposed waters of the lake toward Sault Ste. Marie, a distance of some 230 miles of open, unprotected water. By 7 p.m. that evening, midway between Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula, the southwest wind began to howl. What started as a brisk breeze quickly escalated into a full-scale November gale. The temperature plummeted, and the rain turned into a blinding horizontal blizzard. In the Great Lakes, this is the November cyclone, a meteorological monster born from colliding air masses that transforms the water into a chaotic, crushing force. The winds surged to 50, then 60 knots. The waves, no longer rhythmic swells, became 30-foot walls of freezing freshwater. Because Lake Superior is less dense than the ocean, these waves are shorter, steeper, and hit with a frequency that gives a ship no time to recover. The Inkerman and the Cerisoles, with their top-heavy deck guns and narrow beams, began to take on massive amounts of water over their starboard rails. They were no longer sailing. They were fighting for their lives. Inside the lead ship, the Sebastopol, the situation had descended into a nightmare. This tough little ship was being punished unmercifully. Massive surges of water hammered the decks, leaking through hatches and seeping into the coal bunkers. Below deck, in the engine room, the heat of the fireboxes met the freezing flood of the lake. The engineers fought a desperate battle to keep the coal fires burning as water poured down from above, threatening to extinguish the very heart of the vessel. If the fires went out, the engines would die. If the engines died, the ship would fall into a trough and be rolled over in seconds. The human cost was equally devastating. The French sailors, heroes of the North Sea, who had never known seasickness on the long rollers of the Atlantic, were incapacitated. The violent, erratic motion of the lake, described by some as a washing machine of water, broke their equilibrium. Experienced men were reduced to a state of desperate helplessness. Leclerc later reported that as the waves cresting at 15 to 20 feet began to punish the vessel, the crew neared a point of total panic. At 11 p.m., the disaster nearly claimed the Sebastopol. The ship's helmsman lost control of the wheel as a massive wave struck the stern. The vessel fell off into a trough, tilting to a terrifying angle. Leclerc, realizing that his command was on the verge of foundering, had to physically take the helm himself. He fought the wheel, straining against the raw power of the lake to bring the ship's nose back into the wind. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated terror, a realization that the timid lot had been right all along. The blizzard had now reduced visibility to zero. The masthead lights of the following ships were the only tether keeping the flotilla together. Leclerc attempted to lead his group toward the lee of the Keweenaw Peninsula, hoping to find refuge in Bate Grise or Copper Harbor. But in the screaming wind and the blinding snow, the Inkerman and the Cerisoles were struggling. They were taking on water faster than their pumps could clear it. Their high center of gravity made every roll a gamble with eternity. Then came the moment that has haunted Great Lakes history for over a century. It was approximately 1 a.m. on November 24th. The Sebastopol was battling through a particularly violent surge of waves near the Keweenaw Point. Leclerc looked back through the frosted glass of the bridge, searching for the dim, flickering lights of the Inkerman and the Cerisoles that had been trailing behind at their prescribed intervals. One moment, they were there, ghostly shapes in the whiteout, struggling against the freshwater giants. The next moment, there was only darkness. The lights didn't fade. They vanished. There was no radio call, no red flare cutting through the snow, no scream over the howling gale. There was only the sudden, terrifying realization that the void behind the Sebastopol was empty. Leclerc, perhaps still clinging to his pride, assumed the other ships had simply been obscured by the snow or had sought shelter elsewhere. He continued to fight his own vessel, losing helm control twice more during the night, only regaining it with great effort. As dawn broke on November 24th, the Sebastopol finally reached the protected waters of Bate Grise. Leclerc scanned the small bay, fully expecting to see the Inkerman and the Cerisoles safely anchored, having survived the night. But the bay yawned empty. The only sound was the wind and the crashing of waves against the rocky shore. One of the Canadian pilots, the men Leclerc had mocked, turned to the lieutenant. He didn't need a sonar or a radio to know the truth. He looked at the empty horizon and said simply, "They're gone." In that 1 a.m. darkness, somewhere 10 miles north of Manitou Light, the Inkerman and the Cerisoles had likely broached. Overwhelmed by the weight of their own guns and the relentless hammer of the waves, they had rolled over and plunged to the bottom, taking 78 souls with them in a matter of seconds. They didn't die in a minefield in France. They didn't die in the trenches of the Great War. They died because of a tactical error, a decision to challenge a lake that does not care for military rank or decorated history. The storm of November 1918 eventually subsided, but the silence it left behind was absolute. For days, then weeks, and then decades, Lake Superior held its breath. When a ship vanishes without a word, the vacuum it leaves is filled by questions, the where and the why. In the case of the Inkerman and the Cerisoles, the answers arrived not in the form of a hull, but in haunting, fragmented whispers from the shoreline. The first clue arrived on a desolate stretch of beach east of Grand Marais, Michigan. Searchers discovered a small boat, a yawl, tossed onto the sand by the fury of the lake. On its bow, the name was still clearly visible, Cerisoles. But it was the interior of the boat that told the most terrifying story. The oars remained neatly tucked in their locks, completely unused. In the maritime world, this is a silent witness to a sudden catastrophe. It tells us that there was no time for a desperate scramble into lifeboats. There was no organized evacuation. The ship didn't sink slowly. It foundered so violently and so quickly that the yawl was simply torn from its cradles by a wall of water as the vessel plunged toward the bottom. 78 men didn't even have the chance to fight for their lives on the surface. As the years turned into decades, the mystery only deepened, leading to a discovery in 1934 that still chills the blood of historians. On the remote and rugged shores of Michipicoten Island, at a place called West Sand Bay, several fishermen stumbled across a site that seemed to belong to a ghost story. They found 2 skeletons, half buried in the sand, still wrapped in the tattered, salt-stained remnants of what appeared to be French Navy uniforms. The fishermen reportedly found identification discs, ID tags, strung around the necks of the remains. These discs were the key to everything. They were the bridge back to families in France who had spent 16 years wondering about the fate of their loved ones. The fishermen claimed they sent these tags to the proper authorities. But then, the trail went cold. The tags vanished. No official records of the discovery were ever filed, and the tags were never seen again. Whether it was bureaucratic incompetence or something more sinister, the identity of those 2 souls was lost for a second time. Were they survivors who managed to reach the shore only to die of exposure in the frozen wilderness? We may never know. Beyond these haunting physical clues, maritime experts have spent a century dissecting the why. The most widely accepted explanation is broaching. Remember the technical portrait of these ships: the high center of gravity, the narrow beam, and those heavy 4-inch deck guns. In a 30-foot sea, if a ship loses helm control even for a second, it falls into the trough between waves. For a top-heavy vessel like the Navarin class, a massive broadside hit from a November giant would have acted like a lever, flipping the ship over in an instant. Once the deck guns pointed toward the bottom, the physics of the lake took over. They rolled, they filled, and they plummeted. But we must also consider the evidence from the Sebastopol. We know that ship suffered from severe structural leaks. Water was pouring through the decks and hatches, nearly extinguishing the coal fires. It is highly probable that the Inkerman and the Cerisoles suffered the same fate. If their engine rooms flooded, they would have lost all power. A ship without power in a 60-mile-per-hour gale is nothing more than a floating coffin. There is another theory, one that speaks to the courage of these French sailors. It suggests a failed rescue attempt. In the chaos of 1 a.m., it is possible that one vessel became disabled, and the other, seeing her sister in distress, refused to leave her behind. In the extreme conditions of Lake Superior, attempting to come alongside another vessel to transfer a crew is a suicidal maneuver. They may have collided, or both been overwhelmed by the same monstrous wave as they huddled together in the darkness. It is a theory of mutual destruction, born from a bond of brotherhood that even the storm could not break. And then, there is the conspiracy theory. Floating around the Canadian side for years was a wild suggestion that the ships were intentionally scuttled for insurance money. Proponents of this theory argued that since the war was over, the ships were worth more at the bottom of the lake than on the market. But we must look at the logic. This wasn't a cargo of grain or coal. This was a crew of 79 men. To believe in a scuttling is to believe that the French Navy would intentionally murder nearly 80 of its own decorated war heroes for a $2.6 million insurance claim. It is a theory that ignores the human cost and the reality of the 24th of November gale. The search for the truth continues, but these clues, the unused oars at Grand Marais, the lost skeletons of Michipicoten, and the mechanical vulnerabilities of the Navarin class, all point to a single, devastating reality. The Inkerman and the Cerisoles were out of their element, trapped in a transition between war and peace, and ultimately claimed by a lake that demands perfection from those who sail her. The clues are there, scattered across the beaches and hidden in the depths, waiting for the day when the big lake finally decides to tell the rest of the story. For over a century, Lake Superior has guarded the Inkerman and the Cerisoles with a cold, relentless grip. This is not just a body of water. It is a vast, liquid fortress. To search for these ships is to engage in a high-stakes duel between human ingenuity and the raw power of nature. The challenges are staggering. We are talking about depths reaching 700 feet, dark, freezing, and under immense pressure. But the lake has a secret weapon that renders even our best technology nearly blind: magnetic anomalies. The massive deposits of iron ore beneath the lake bed create magnetic ghosts that scramble sensors and distort navigation. In this graveyard of iron, finding two steel-framed warships is like trying to find a needle in a field of magnets. Despite these hurdles, the flame of curiosity has never gone out. In 2018, marking the 100th anniversary of the disappearance, Michigan Technological University's Great Lakes Research Center launched a student-led crowd-funded expedition. They deployed side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, pushing into waters deeper than anyone had dared to suggest. These modern pioneers were driven by the belief that, with enough precision, the lake would finally yield. This drive led to a moment of breathtaking irony in 2023. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, collaborating with the television series Expedition Unknown, utilized high-resolution sonar and multi-beam echo sounders to investigate promising anomalies. They found a wreck, intact and hauntingly preserved in 300 feet of water. For a moment, the world held its breath. Was this the Inkerman? Was it the Cerisoles? But the lake had played a trick on history. The vessel was not French, and it wasn't from 1918. It was the tugboat Satellite, a ship that had been missing since 1879. It was a stark reminder that while we look for one mystery, the lake is hiding 1,000 others. Keeping this search alive are men like Fred Stonehouse and Bruce Lynn. They are the keepers of the light, the guardians of this maritime legend. Bruce Lynn, as the executive director of the Shipwreck Historical Society, continues to sift through dusty archives, recently uncovering a 1918 report that verified the finding of the Cerisoles yawl. Fred Stonehouse, through decades of analysis, keeps the names of these 79 men from fading into the mist. They understand that these aren't just shipwrecks. They are unresolved chapters of human history. As of today, the Inkerman and the Cerisoles remain undiscovered. The technology evolves: drones, AI mapping, and advanced sonar, but the lake remains superior. The search continues not just for steel and wood, but for closure. For 100 years, it has been a battle of wills. We bring our lights and our cameras. The lake brings its darkness and its ice. But as long as men like Stonehouse and Lynn keep the fire burning, we will never stop looking. Because somewhere beneath those dark waves, 79 souls are waiting to be remembered. The tragedy of the Inkerman and the Cerisoles leaves behind a legacy of bitter ironies, For the 10 sister ships that successfully completed the journey, the glorious military mission they were built for never truly arrived. Following the armistice on November 11th, 1918, the French Navy's desperate need for minesweepers faded as peacetime priorities shifted. These tough little warships never cleared a single German mine in European waters. Instead, they were sold as war surplus, stripped of their deck guns and converted into humble fishing trawlers, a quiet civilian end for vessels born from the fires of the Great War. But for the maritime world, their loss remains a stern, eternal warning. It is a testament to the fatal danger of dismissing local expertise. Lieutenant Leclerc's dismissal of his veteran Canadian pilots as a timid lot remains one of the most haunting lessons in maritime history. It reminds every mariner that Lake Superior is not merely a pond, but a treacherous inland sea where freshwater physics defy oceanic experience. The lack of buoyancy in freshwater and the jackhammer frequency of a November gale prove that this lake demands a respect that no military rank or decorated history can override. Most importantly, we honor the 79 souls, the French war heroes and the Canadian pilots who were claimed by the deep. These were men who survived the bloodiest conflict in human Sioux, only to be taken by a blizzard 13 days after the peace was signed. They never reached the safety of Montreal, and they never saw the shores of France again. They remain forever part of Lake Superior's ghostly fleet, a reminder that the human cost of war often lingers long after the guns fall silent. Finally, before we conclude today's journey into the abyss, if this mystery has touched you, or if you carry your own stories of the Great Lakes' hidden graveyards, please share them in the comments below. Let us keep these memories alive together. If you found value in our exploration today, I invite you to like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for our next maritime investigation. Your support allows us to continue bringing these forgotten legends back to the surface. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in our next video. Until then, keep exploring.